Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is finally time for the 2025 Mid-Season Invitational, and that means it's Primer and Power Rankings time here on this channel. I'm super excited to get into MSI. There are 10 teams at the tournament this year. One of the smaller MSIs ever, obviously ever since they introduced the multiple teams from multiple regions, but even before that, we had so many minor regions participating in the play-in stage that it almost was, like a 12, 14 team tournament on its own anyways, but we're back down to 10, only 2 teams from each of the 5 regions representing each other. Obviously, that makes things a little bit more competitive, and it makes things a little bit more difficult to break through. So who do I think will be the teams to break through? That's what we're going to talk about here today. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. We posted our meta report video yesterday here on the channel, kind of going over the picks you can expect to see almost every single series, and then picks you can kind of watch out for, and things that will define the meta as we continue to go along in terms of draft. But today we're talking about the teams and the players, and this is going to be an in-depth breakdown. We're going to go over everything. I'm going to be giving my thoughts on every single player at this tournament. I will be power ranking not only every single team from number 1 to number 10, but every player in their role from number 1 to number 10, as we always do. I will also this year be showing my grades, at least on the grading scale, the A to D grading scale that I have, kind of talking about where I think each player ends up landing. That way I can, kind of differentiate more which players are in a cluster rather than just, this player's number 4 and this player's number 6. Maybe they're actually the same grade and there's not really a big difference. That's going to happen quite a bit in today's video because I think a lot of the players at this tournament are both good and bad at the same time, but I'm super excited. We're going to be talking about playstyle differences between every team, playstyle expectations for these teams, where you need to watch out for if you're maybe a major region fan and you don't want to get upset by a minor region team, like just what you need to be careful of and all of that stuff and more. If you guys are excited, I really don't ask for this a lot at the beginning of videos, but please hit the like button. These primer videos are definitely the ones where we put the most amount of effort into because it's me going back and watching every single playoff game from every single team at this tournament. I know we've covered all 4 of the major regions all year long, and for the past 4 years, every single game on this channel, but I always go back and watch the playoffs again anyways, just to make sure that my opinions are as up to date and as accurate as they possibly can be. Some disclaimers at the beginning of the video. First and foremost, as per usual, this is my opinion. If you're gonna sit there and be like, you are stupid for having X player or X team above Y team or Y player, that's totally fine for you to have that opinion. Just respect that this is mine. Like I said, I have been watching all 4 of the major regions. That's the LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL, every single game for, years and years and years, covering it on the channel now. I have a pretty good track record of having these international power rankings be accurate, but not everything is going to be perfect. There are going to be some teams that have identical grades in terms of their letter grade or identical grades in terms of their player grades, and all of that breaks down into saying, well, one of them has to be below the other because this is a power rankings list. Don't take it all that seriously. Every team, every player can move 1 or 2 spots up or down, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised, especially if they're within the same letter grade tier or something like that, or even like 1 letter grade off. I think that's a very good way to kind of talk about it, but also I am going to, kind of be a little bit harsher on these teams. I do think there's a pretty big difference between the good teams and the okay teams at this tournament, and I'll kind of make that clear. But that's all the preamble out of the way. I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. Let's get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do, obviously, is go from number 10 to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about the teams in ascending order, and that means, unfortunately, starting with the team that I think is the worst at the tournament, and this one should be no surprise to anybody. I think this is the consensus number 10 team at the tournament. It's the representative from the LTA South. It's Furia, and I really don't think that there is any argument against this. I don't think that there is any team that's even close to the tier of Furia. For context, they're at a C-. The next best team at number 9 is at a C+, and so there's like a whole, gap in between where I think they're at and where I think everybody else is at, and I think, unfortunately for them, it's just kind of the product of the system. I think without really minor region teams going to these tournaments anymore, especially with the LCP actually turning out to be pretty darn good as a region, it's just really difficult for what is essentially a minor region in the LTA South to feel like they can, compete at this level. We've already seen what their best teams can do against even North American teams in the playoffs in the winter split, and now you have a team in Furia who already should probably not be at this tournament. They're likely not the most talented team coming out of the LTA South, but they end up up going on a big run. Shout out ThinkCard, undefeated. This guy's an absolute menace. But, you know, you now have this team that is lacking in raw talent, raw mechanical skill, going to a tournament that's basically full of raw mechanical talent. You're just playing the best teams in the world right now, and I just don't think Furia has what it takes to compete. But I'll kind of talk about where I think they could theoretically surprise, and if they are going to generate advantages, where I think they'll likely be. As you can see up on the screen, the things that you're seeing now, you're going to see why they got here, the essentially what seed they're taking, in this case LTA number 2. I think that's fair to say what they are. They were LTA South number 1, but that is the second seed coming out of the LTA region in general, so that's why I put it that way, especially to keep it consistent with everything else. The number 10 obviously indicating they are 10th in the power rankings. Their letter grade as a team, in this case C-, because they're just not a particularly good team. And then as you can see, all 5 players across the starting lineup, they'll have a number in parentheses next to their name. That's where I rank them personally within their own position. So in this case, all of them are 10th, last place in their own positions, and then their letter grades below that, their 3 most played champions even further below that. This is as much information as I think I can fit onto the screen. I will talk about what I think is relevant, and you can kind of check out on your own what you believe to be less essential information, we'll just say. But let's go ahead and get into the lineup. Of course, Furia's lineup is looking like Guigo in the top lane, Tatu in the jungle, Toots in the mid lane, IU at AD carry, and JoJo at support. If I mispronounce any names for this team in particular, please correct me. It's obviously a little bit difficult to watch all of these games on 1x speed, so I'm often not listening to commentary, and this is just kind of my general idea for maybe how their names would sound. Again, if you think I'm correct or incorrect, if I'm pronouncing a name right or wrong, just let me know. I'll have that fixed for when we go over their games at MSI. But talking specifically about where I think this team's strengths and weaknesses lie, to me the strengths are very clear. A very aggressive top side that wants to play for skirmishes early, a support who's very active at being able to roam and is the primary playmaker for this team, and then, you know, hopefully carries that can step up and actually deal damage in some of these fights. That's the part I'm definitely less locked in on, and we will talk about that. But let's start with the good. The best player on this team is pretty unquestionably, in my opinion, JoJo in the support position. 2 JoJos at this tournament, as we'll talk about a bit later. But this JoJo, I think, is actually kind of interesting as a playmaker. I think he's very active, and it's clear that he wants to try to link up with Tatu pretty early on in these games. The concern I have is just that there are a lot of supports who want to do this at this tournament. I talked about this a bit in the meta report, but these supports that really kind of jumped on the playmaker bandwagon a lot more than the others, the ones who were playing Nico and Rakan more so than your Rel and your Nautilus and things like that, they're the ones who have actually found a lot more success over the course of this year, because I think those other champions are just a little bit more predictable in terms of how their engage angles land. If you are a creative support and you're playing Nico and Rakan more often than a lot of other champs, you're probably going to have more agency, and I think that's where JoJo ends up coming in. I don't think he's a superstar. Could he look better on a different team? Maybe, but again, like, I think he's probably this team's best player. But he's not their carry, obviously. He's their support. He's their playmaker. Their carry is absolutely Guigo on the top side. That's not even really all that debatable. He is the one who honestly receives the most amount of resources. And the thing that really jumped out to me when I was watching tape for Furia, both in the playoffs and in the regular season, because I did go and check out some of their regular season games because their performances across those 2 tournaments were not the same. They were not as good in the regular season as they were in the playoffs, and I wanted to see what changed and what improved. The thing that very much jumped out at me when it came to Guigo is just this guy does not care about lane. Like, he wants to fight all the time. He wants to, you know, try and take these skirmishes around Grubs and around Herald, and he wants to move around and, you know, fight in the jungle, and he just constantly wants to skirmish, and I think that can actually be a big positive towards what this team wants to do. But he is definitely the most active player on this team, which is very strange coming out of the top lane position, but you see that in the champion pool. He's playing a lot more Camille than basically anybody else at this tournament. Aatrox is a pick that he's picked a lot, something that can be active in the early game, that has a lot of innate and inherent combat power that doesn't necessarily need to wait for its item spikes, but still can be useful in a couple of instances. Of course, he can still play a lot of the meta top laners, but I think when you're looking at a player that could surprise, mechanically speaking, from Furia, Guigo is definitely the one that kind of stood out to me on the top side. Tatu is the other player that's really important towards what Furia do. I'm just concerned about how that's going to translate to the international stage when he starts going up against really good junglers very regularly. Tatu is your classic, like, facilitator type of support. He's playing a lot of Skarner, a lot of Sejuani. He is very willing to sacrifice resources in order to get his laners ahead, specifically top lane, but also linking up with JoJo and trying to make plays around objectives. They really want to prioritize those, and Tatu is a big reason for that. But the concern for me is that playstyle, especially one that's already kind of up and down domestically, really has not translated historically to, international performances for these minor region teams. It's just not been something that has worked all that well. I'm concerned about Tatu's mechanics. I don't think he's really all that good of a jungle pather or like an early game skirmisher, and so that really creates a situation where, like, okay, well, if you're going up against, in this case, like Skewmond in your first best of 5, like, do you even have the skill to be able to match him in terms of how that jungle matchup goes? That's something that's really going to matter a lot for Furia's success rate, because again, Tatu is so important as a facilitator towards what they want to do. But those are the 3 players that actively, I think, pushed Furia forward. And then I think you have Toots and IU, and I'll just be frank with you guys, I don't think they're very good. IU has some interesting mechanics. I don't think he's like a problem. He's just not a main character at all for this team. They constantly put him on Misfortune and Jhin and Ashe and all of these more background AD carries, and he doesn't really get the chance to ever shine. JoJo is much more often leaving the 2v2 and trying to affect the map alongside Tatu to generate resources elsewhere than trying to play for IU in any meaningful way. He is almost always weak side AD carry. Maybe that changes going into this tournament, because I do think they're going to need a little bit of an extra oomph, and we've seen that in the past, that teams that maybe don't play around their ADCs domestically play more around them internationally. We'll see. I don't think he's horrible mechanically speaking from what I've seen. He's done everything he's supposed to do. He's just asked to do so little on this team. But to me, the one player that is like genuinely concerning is Toots in the mid lane, who I just don't think is very good. We'll see how that ends up aging. He played a lot of the meta mid laners, Talia, Ahri, things like that throughout this year, but I just really was not impressed. Tatu was doing a lot as a facilitator to generate resources for top lane, and JoJo was moving around, and somehow none of those resources ever made their way mid lane. Even in their series, because they played Pain twice in the playoffs. They lost to them in winners finals, and then of course beat them in the grand finals 3-0. That series that they lost against Pain, like, Toots got abused by Roamer. Like, it was really just not a very good matchup for him, and if that's already happening domestically in the LTA South, like, this guy's gonna get massacred by Caps at MSI. Like, that's just kind of what you would expect. I think he is the weakest player I saw on tape for this team, but who knows? Like, maybe things turn around. Again, you never really know how players are going to adapt to, like, a different tournament, especially one that's, an international somewhere else in the world. Maybe they fly and they get, even more empowered playing on, NA solo queue for a little bit of time to prep for MSI, all of that stuff. But at least looking at this team, it's basically impossible to project them as anything other than the worst team at this tournament. If you're doing anything other than putting them at number 10, I genuinely think you're trolling. I mean that respectfully. And I don't think that's because the LTA South is just horrible as a region, but they have to prove something. They got absolutely decimated by the LTA North, by North America in the winter split. They didn't even make it out of one best of 5 against them. And you got to show that you can at least compete at some level before I give you anything other than a bottom tier ranking. Do I think there's talent on this team? Sure, I think Wigo, JoJo, like, they're interesting players, but this is already a team that didn't really look like the most mechanically dominant team in their region, and now they're being asked to go up against perhaps like a Bilibili Gaming or something like that in the play-in stage. It's just not looking great for a team like Furia, and I would expect them to maybe shock the world and win a game here or there, but certainly not a series overall. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and this one was also pretty easy for me, all things considered. I think the bottom 2 teams were very clear when watching tape, and coming in at number 9 for me, it is going to be GAM Esports, the number 2 seed from the LCP. Again, this felt pretty obvious to me. Furia is obviously number 10, and I think GAM is pretty obviously number 9. I just would be surprised if this team ended up overperforming this kind of ranking, because while I do think they have good players, I think they're honestly carried more by name value than they are by actual talent right now in terms of what I've seen on tape. I've been talking about that with this team for quite a while, even going back to last year as well. I was already starting to get a little bit lower on players like Levi and players like Kiaya in the top lane. Maybe not as much Kiaya, because I'm just such a big fan of how he plays the game, and I still think he's the best player on this team, but like, there is more name value than there is like actual raw tape on this team this year in terms of what we've seen. So I'm kind of excited to go over it. This will also be a pretty quick wrap up, all things considered, maybe even quicker than Furia. Their lineup lineup is looking like Kiaya in the top lane, Levi in the jungle, Emo and Ares in the mid lane. Ares, I don't know how to say that. Let me know. He might not even play. Emo played basically all of the playoffs anyways. Artemis in the AD carry role and Elio in the support position. Everybody on this team is going to be familiar to people who have watched international competition for one reason or another. Of course, Kiaya, Levi, Emo, Elio, familiar from this GAM team last year. They switched out AD carries. They brought in Artemis, who's of course had some time in the international spotlight before, representing Vietnam, but this team is not as interesting as maybe you would think they would be, at least in my opinion from the tape that I saw. There were multiple teams in the LCP that I thought were more interesting than GAM, and I'm not going to say unfortunately they're the representatives, just rather I don't know if they're necessarily going to translate in the same kind of way that CFO did earlier on this year. I think a lot of people have really high expectations for this region because of how good the Oysters were at first stand. I don't know if GAM's going to be able to live up to those particular expectations, so I guess we can go over why. First, let's talk about the good. Kiaya still very good. Like, he's still the best player on this team. He's still the one that's pushing their advantages the most. I think the only concerning thing for me is that top lane's pretty good at this tournament. It's probably the deepest role at this entire tournament, and so Kiaya might not be able to get the same kind of leads that maybe if you had the same caliber of player mid lane or the same caliber of player bot lane, you'd be able to generate in the same kind of way. I think top lane is just a lot harder to take advantage of. That being said, a lot of the good top laners at this tournament aren't exactly the most 1v1 focused players in the world. They're players that are very good at being able to play the map, either good team fighters or alternatively good skirmishers, as we already talked about with someone, like we go for Furia in the number 10 spot. But Kiaya actually is just a great 1v1 player. That's always been where he's shined as a player. Generally speaking, like a lot of the Southeast Asian regions play a lot less lane swappy, at least from what I've noticed in comparison to some of the major regions, and Kiaya's gotten a lot more experience actually playing this 1v1 style. It still is something that can be punished by other teams, and Kiaya is a player who's always been so dominant domestically, easily the best player, in my opinion, in the history of this region. And obviously, Levi can maybe make the argument for that, but Kiaya's just been so ridiculously consistent. The problem is he's never been that internationally. He's always been good, but not great. He's never been able to elevate a team into legendary status in the same way that you had in, 2018 with somebody like Levi. So, it's just one of those things where you're kind of hoping Kiaya ends up figuring it out. I think this is a good meta for him to be able to do so internationally. Maybe I'm just being too harsh. I've just been such a Kiaya glazer before every single international tournament for what feels like 4 or 5 years in a row at this point, and he's never really been that star that I'm expecting him to be. He's never been the guy who's gone up against, Western top laners, like North American and European top laners, and just straight up been better than them in every capacity. We have not seen that kind of performance yet. Do I think that could happen here? I do think it's possible. I just don't know if GAM as a team is good enough elsewhere to allow him to be able to do that, but Kiaya is still the best player on this team. And then you've still got Levi in the jungle. Levi's still fine, and he probably is still the second best player on this team. The problem is, I don't think he's quite as good as maybe his name would suggest anymore. I said this last year, going into Worlds and going into, MSI. Like, last year, I was like, I'm really just not sure if this is the guy that everybody thinks he is anymore. He's still playing a lot of Nocturne. It's still his signature champion, but he looks a lot more consistent when he doesn't have to be the main carry, when he gets to play things like Maokai. That's when he starts to look a lot more comfortable in the current meta. The Xin Zhao obviously still can work, and he does want to be a playmaker. You're going to see a lot of Nocturne, Tristana, even in terms of like the aggressive mid lane tendencies here. But overall, like, Levi is easily the 9th best jungler at this tournament. I don't think he's in the same category as even, 8+. Like, I think he is like at least half a step down from everybody else in terms of the tape that I've seen, not only this year, but last year as well. Again, just not as consistent. I think a lot of the early games aren't nearly as good as they used to be. His mid games are still phenomenal, but a much more limited player than maybe, again, his name recognition would indicate that he is. And then you get to talk about this mid lane situation, which is kind of strange. I put Emo up here because he basically played the entirety of their playoff run, and so that's who I'm assuming is going to play here for GAM. But once again, the LCP is kind of obsessed with this 6-man roster idea. They're certainly not the only team at this tournament that's going to be able to employ something like this, and so, whatever ends up happening in the mid lane, whether it's Emo, whether it's Ares or however you end up saying it, I'm going to say Ares. Again, just correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I promise I will have that fixed by the beginning of MSI. Whoever ends up playing in the mid lane, they just need to be able to stabilize. Levi and Kiaya are such resource-heavy players that you don't really need a mid laner that's going to go out and dominate the game. Playing things like Talia and Ryze and Galio, like, that's the kind of style that I'm pretty sure GAM is going to want to try and opt into a little bit more frequently, like we talked about in yesterday's video. Emo's fine in that role. He was miserable in his international debut last year, but, hopefully he's been able to clean some stuff up and be able to perform a bit better. He was okay in the playoffs. He certainly wasn't, like, great or awful. awful. He was good enough to be able to pass, and I think that that's okay at this level. You know, the LCP, it's not like the LTA South where I kind of wanted you to be the best player in your region. Like, if you wanted to go and represent your region internationally, like, I'm more okay with the idea that Emo was, you know, a slightly above average mid laner in the LCP, and therefore will be okay at this level. But the one lane that I'm actually super concerned about from the tape that I watched is bot lane. This bot lane was garbage. Like, quite frankly, there's really not a lot to like about the way these two played off of each other. Artemis in particular just was not very good. Watching the tape, I was very surprised because Artemis is a player who I've really liked in the past. I think he has really good mechanics, and I think there are a lot of ways that he can take over games. We talked about that when he was on the Team Wales in the past, but man, it did not this year. Like, the tape that I saw was just not good. He's asked to play weak side all the time, but he's doing it on strong picks, things like Varus, things like Xayah, you know, things you would expect him to be able to survive on. And when he is asked to be a carry, he is getting to play things like Kai'Sa, and yet it's just not going well. He's always behind in gold. He's always behind in pressure. You know, part of that is Elio, who I just don't think is a particularly good support. I didn't think that last year. I think he's kind of a stereotypical Jag, which is an acronym for non-sports fans that stands for just a guy. Like, he doesn't really do anything particularly special, at least for me on tape. Again, another player who did a really good job taking advantage of the fact that Rakan and Nico were a lot better than people thought they were at the beginning of the year and got a lot of elo because of that, but he doesn't do anything special outside of being a pretty good playmaker. He's not like a dominant support in any real aspect of the game, and I think there maybe even is an argument that he's the number 10 support at this tournament because I do kind of like JoJo, but Elio, I think, you know, he didn't impress me, and Artemis was even worse. Like, again, like, you're sitting here and you're like, man, they're losing every game 2v2 in big moments. It just can't really happen. This bot lane can't play the way they did domestically and be able to survive. I think the good thing is that these players have experience internationally being better than whatever they showed on tape this split. If they're going to be what they were domestically, this team is going to be number 9 by a large margin, and they might even drop games to Furia because that's how bad this bot lane genuinely was. If they're going to be what I think they are, which is what I'm grading them out to be here, C+ caliber players, players that maybe aren't like dominant at this level, who aren't going to be able to go up against major region players and succeed super successfully, but players that can hold their own, aren't going to be down 4 billion CS. Like, if that's going to be the case, then I think this team is pretty clearly number 9. They're definitely better than Furia, who's the worst team at this tournament, but I think they're a clear step down from everybody else 8 and above at this tournament as well. I think it's really going to be up to the top side, as it almost always is when it comes to GAM, whether or not this team is successful. At least you have players on that side of the map that you can be excited about, but I think they're one of 2 teams at this tournament that I really just would be surprised if they ended up upsetting people. Then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is where things get a little bit dicey in terms of the order. I think basically 5 through 8 are all the exact same grade for me. They're all going to come in the exact same tier, and so you can put them in whatever order you want. And quite frankly, I think the team coming in at number 8 is going to be a bit controversial for me, but it is going to be CTBC Flying Oyster. It's the Flying Oysters coming in at 8, the number 1 seed from the LCP, and a team that did incredibly well at the first stand tournament. I think a lot of people are looking at this roster and looking at these players and saying a top 5 or a top 6 finish is very reasonable for them, and I would agree. I do believe a top 5 or top 6 finish, maybe even top 4 if everything were to go right, is potentially possible for the Flying Oysters, but I think there are genuine reasons to maybe expect some, I would guess, regressions from what they were at first stand, not just because I think that tournament was very weird. I think that there were a couple of teams at that tournament that just played a lot worse than what they actually were, most notably Top Esports and K-Corp, who I think were just underperforming throughout the entirety of that tournament, but I think the Flying Oysters also have their own inbuilt problems that might get exposed a bit more playing against more teams rather than just a 5-team tournament. That being said, like, the overperformance that we saw there, it's not all for nothing. It's not like that all just disappears in terms of my expectations. There's a reason that they're coming into the B tier. We saw where a lot of these other teams were. You know, we just talked about it, like C- for Furia. This is a team that I don't really feel comfortable being at the tournament. GAM, who I think, you know, in most cases would be the weakest team at the tournament in a C+ grade. You're jumping all the way up to B. This is the same grade, like I said, as number 5. So still a lot going for them. Let's go over their lineup, I guess. Their 6-man lineup, because they're really the only team at this tournament that actively utilizes 6 players all the time. It's going to be Rest and Driver kind of swapping out in the top lane, Gen.G in the jungle, Hongq in the mid lane, Doggo at AD carry, and Kaiwing at support. Pretty easy conversations for the most part when it comes to a lot of these players. I'm going to start with the good, the best players on the team. Honestly, jungle mid is the positive for this team right now. The one player that I'm honestly starting to buy all in on is Hongq in the mid mid lane. I think this guy is like actually special. I think he has the chance to become the best player in the LCP pretty quickly. If he's not already the best player in the LCP, this guy genuinely is just so ridiculously fun to watch. He's constantly winning in the mid lane, and he's doing it on these like throwback picks. He honestly reminds me of a lot of the old LCK mid laners, players like, you know, Kuro that won a lot using Azir and Victor and Ahri. Like, it's that kind of style of play that Hongyu really reminds me of, and I think that that's something really exciting for LCP fans, for Flying Oyster fans moving forward, because he's the kind of player that you absolutely can build around. And quite frankly, if there's one player that deserves to be ranked above number 8 in terms of their individual position when it comes to CFO, it's probably Hongyu. The problem is mid lane is also a position that I think is pretty good at this tournament, all things considered, especially in terms of upside. If you wanted him at number 7, a spoiler alert, above a player like Quad, I can kind of understand that. If you just think that Hongyu is a better player, I'm not even really going to argue that all that much, but for me, it's really difficult to say that, at least at the current moment, with the form that, you know, Quad, Jojo, Caps, like the players that he's going to be kind of in contention for. I just think that they're all in better form than, you know, he would be expected to be coming into this tournament. B- though might be a bit disrespectful. If you want to bring that up to a B, I totally understand it. I do think he's the best player on this team, and Gen.G is also right there with him. Gen.G still is a really, really good player. The one thing I'm going to fault him for is that he's become more selfish as he's played in the LCP as opposed to his time in the LPL. One of the things he did really well in the LPL was be a facilitator, be an enabler. That's why he was brought in over Jeje at the time, was because Jeje was a lot more focused on trying to get himself and Scout really fed in the middle of the map, where Gen.G was like, well, I'm playing with Viper. Why don't I just play for Viper, right? Like, that's kind of why he worked for Edward Gaming in the LPL when he was playing there. But ever since he's gone over to the LCP and gone back to, you know, kind of being a big fish in a smaller pond, I think he's gotten more greedy in terms of the way that he's wanted to try and play the game. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. I would argue that his performance at First Stand was maybe his best international performance ever, though, and I think if that is the trajectory that we're kind of waiting to see on, that's really exciting. One of the big reasons why I was frustrated with Gen.G for a long time is it felt like, you know, I talked about this earlier, that facilitator playstyle where you are the big fish in a small pond, it doesn't really translate to international success, and he was kind of the poster child for that. But ever since First Stand, I think my reputation on him in that regard has kind of turned around. I think he's gotten more greedy and aggressive in terms of generating resources for himself and less so for everybody else on the team, and has really started to become a leader in that way, and kind of a guy to push the entire team through, to put the team on his back, and I think that makes them better. Doggo's the other B- player coming in here. You know, Doggo's going to get a lot of hype coming into this tournament because he was great at First Stand, and while I do think Doggo is very good, I think it's going to be a bit more obvious what Doggo is going into this tournament. I think he is right around the skill level of the Western AD carries, players like Masu, players like Hansama. I think Doggo's like in that cluster. A lot of them are going to be a B-. Like, don't get surprised to see that grade a lot for AD carries, but I don't know if he's necessarily going to be as consistent. He is a carry, and he's somebody who does like to step up, but he likes to play early game aggressive picks. Honestly, he reminds me a ton of Hansama at this tournament, and if you wanted to put him above Hansama, I think that's totally fair. I'm not going to do that. He's going to come in at number 8 for me. And again, like, I do think that there are, you know, explanations and arguments for putting all 3 of these players higher in terms of their individual rankings. I'm just not going to be the one to personally do that. And then you've got the 3 quote-unquote players that I'm a little bit less confident on. Rest and Driver we'll talk about first, because they are basically like a 50-50 split on the top side of the map, especially with basically, I think, actually every single series at this tournament being a best of 5. I think Rest and Driver are likely going to get close to a 50-50 split throughout this entire tournament. You know, I think Driver's been really good as of late. I think there's been a lot of positives to talk about when it comes to his ability to kind of be more of a stable like presence on the top side of the map. I think things like Scion have really stood out as positive picks for him. Rest was kind of considered to be the more stable player for a long period of time. Right now, Driver is just playing infinitely better. Rest was pretty awful in the playoffs, and that is a bit of a concern for me. If Rest is going to be like your early game pick, and if he's going to be playing things like Jace a lot more frequently like he was in the playoffs, I do think that that actually is a bit concerning to me, because I think Rest, you know, projects less as the 8th best top laner and probably closer to like 9th, maybe even 10th in terms of how he came in at the end of the year, but he was a lot better in the regular season. Again, I did go and watch some regular season tape from the teams that I didn't cover on the channel, and Rest was a lot better in the regular season, so maybe it was just some sort of playoff hiccup. I just wasn't really all that impressed with him. This team was definitely better with Driver in than they were with Rest in, but that means that unfortunately they're coming in, you know, kind of balanced out at number 8, right below Kiaya, who I think is better than Rest and maybe about the same as Driver, maybe slightly better than Driver. They're both very good good top laners, but unfortunately the average grade of those two ends up being just slightly lower. But again, I don't think they're necessarily problems. And then you have Kaiwing. I wish I had a ton to say about Kaiwing. He's really the first support at this tournament that we're talking about that's not like a Nico player in terms of just, you know, spamming that champion as much as absolutely possible. Again, no surprise that a lot of the teams that ended up breaking through into this tournament are Nico teams because that champion is just really good. But Kaiwing is your definition of like good, totally fine support. Again, very similar to what we talked about with Elio, just way better in terms of actual execution. I think his mechanics are a lot more stable. I think he himself is a lot more stable as a player, and I think he's playing with an AD carry that can win a lot more frequently in the early game, which obviously helps a lot. Do I think Kaiwing would be as successful on other teams? Probably not. Like, we've seen this guy internationally before CFO, but I don't know. Like, in terms of the way he's played over the past couple of years, I've not really been watching his tape and being like, this is the guy to drive the team forward. It's really Hongq who's the star here. Doggo's going to get a lot of resources, and typically he's going to be the one who tops damage charts because he is the one they invest in a lot. And then Gen.G has been really good, especially as a greedy skirmisher in the early game. If they can get consistent performances, especially out of players like Rest on the top side, so that you're not just having random games that you drop with Rest not playing well, I think this team absolutely can get top 5 or top 4. I don't want this number 8 ranking to come in as, you know, me trying to be like, oh, this team is bad or they can't play or anything like that. That's certainly not what my intention is by putting them here. I just think there are a lot of teams that are kind of fighting it out for these good, not great spots, and for me, the Flying Oysters just have a few more question marks than maybe those other teams do. But then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings now, and this is a team that honestly I had to talk myself out of putting both higher and lower in these power rankings. It's G2 Esports, the number 2 seed from the LEC, coming in at number 7 for me. This was the only place that felt fair for G2, kind of in the middle of my two minds. There is one part of me that's like, well, it's G2. They're going to come out and they're going to randomly be a top 5 or a top 4 team at this tournament, despite not looking like that at any point so far in 2025, because they're G2. That's what this org does, especially at MSI, a tournament that honestly this org has found a ridiculous amount of success at over their organization's history. This is not a team that ever really fails at MSI. They basically always step up at this tournament. But, you know, when you watch the tape, quite frankly, there's no reason to believe this team is better than the Flying Oysters, who we just talked about. They could absolutely be number 8 in these power rankings, and I wouldn't really be all that upset by that kind of ranking. For me, I ended up trying to find a middle ground, and the middle ground for me is coming in at number 7 in these power rankings, because there are a lot of things they need to work on, but there still are a lot of things that I think are positives for them, generally speaking. So let's go ahead and go over it. Of course, their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Skewmond in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Labrov at support. Let's get the good out of the way, as we almost always do on this channel. First and foremost, Caps is still in good form. It's not been consistent good form. Dude got blasted in the finals, to be entirely, frank, but it's not the first time that's happened with Caps. He's been a player that has had his losses over the course of his career. He's not been this omnipresent, like, perfect winner that never loses, and he's on the decline now and all this yada yada. Is he playing as well as he did last year? No. I don't even think it's really all that arguable that he's not playing as well as he did last year, but I do think he's still in good form, and it's good enough for him to be considered the 5th best mid laner at this tournament, which, if you know how these kinds of tournaments go, 5 is a pretty darn good ranking for a Western player in a tournament like this. It means you're probably the best non-Eastern, like non-top 2 league, player in your position at this tournament. I still rate Caps as the best mid laner in the West, and even though I do think it's more up for debate right now than before, especially if you account more for modern form, I think I'm just expecting him to be good at this tournament. Again, he always plays well at MSI. This has almost always been his tournament in terms of how things have gone. He plays incredibly well at MSI historically, and I think that will continue here. Again, B+ is generous for how his tape has looked so far in 2025, at least from an international perspective, but I do think it is warranted in this case. The only other player who's getting above a B- right now for G2 is Broken Blade in the top lane, and quite frankly, Broken Blade's not been good domestically. He's getting a B because, again, his track record is really good for G2 at these big international tournaments, but his form in 2025 has been a reason why this team has kind of fallen off a bit. I would argue he's not been the 2nd best player on this team. He's not even really been the 3rd best player on this team. There have been a lot of moments where Skewmond and Hansama are better than Broken Blade. You could definitely make that argument, and You know, I think that there is a reasonable way to say that Broken Blade is closer to being what Kiaya is right now than being, like, even respectfully, like what Blippo is over for FlyQuest. Like, that's kind of the form that we've seen him in. But again, I just have to expect that he's going to be able to figure it out. I know that seems a bit like a cop-out, but the version of Broken Blade we've gotten this year just doesn't really feel like the same kind of player that we have seen in recent years when it comes to the tape. He's making a lot of mistakes in the early game, and that's always been a part of his game, especially going back to his pre-G2 days when I was really low on him as a player. But what he's really worked on and what he's gotten super consistent at is playing weak side and playing without resources, and that's just something he's not really done all that well this year. I think maybe locking in a bit more mentally, maybe, you know, getting on a better page with players like Skewmond can maybe help with that. Right now, it doesn't feel like he's super connected to the rest of this team, but again, all it takes is, you know, a couple of weeks of practice for him to be able to get back into form. He's always been a bit of a streaky player, and so if he is going to get back into form, especially if he's going to stop playing things like Jax super regularly, because I do think that was pretty detrimental to his success as a whole. If he's going to start just playing Sion more and playing these weak side top laners that can actually function, or if he's finally going to be able to start regularly playing Gwen and Rumble and the actual strong top laners, I think things are going to be fine. But the solo laners are such a pivot point for G2 as a team. A lot of their success is dependent on whether or not those two step up. And then you've got Hansama. He's the third player I'm going to talk about here because I promise I will get to Skewmond and Labrov in just a moment, but Hans is what he is at this point. Honestly, I feel pretty vindicated for putting him so low in my preseason rankings in the LEC. I think I had him as the fourth best AD carry in the LEC coming into the year, and honestly, I stand by that take. I really don't think there's anything that Hansama does at a super elite level anymore. I think that there was a period of time where he was easily the best 2v2 AD carry in the West, and I do think that there are flashes of that still. There's a reason that Caitlyn appears in his top 3 most played champions, because this guy still wants to get a lead early. But the problem is, first and foremost, he does not have any synergy with Labrov in the 2v2. Labrov is a full-on team fighter. That was the reason he was successful on BDS and on Vitality before he ended up coming over here to G2, and they've asked him to do something entirely different. It means that Hansama can't really play for 2v2 victories because he has a support that's not good there, and Labrov can't really play for teamfight victories because they don't really have an AD carry that's great in the 5v5. So it ends up kind of hurting both of them, but Hansama in particular has just kind of fallen off in terms of the active consistency he can give, and he's never been particularly successful internationally from an individual perspective. From a team perspective, it's been totally fine. He's never been a big enough liability to really hold G2 back, except for Worlds in 2023, where he was very not good, but this is a guy who's always played his worst league internationally, and I just don't really see any reason to rank him otherwise. He comes in as my number 7 AD carry, a big reason why this team is low, and that's the same thing for Skewmond and Labrov. And how can you say that? Skewmond was your first team all-pro jungler in the LEC. He absolutely was my first team all-pro jungler, but if you've listened and watched my analysis on Skewmond throughout this year, I think it's pretty clear where I stand on him. When he's able to play his game and play his style, which is a little bit slower in the early game, getting to these late game 5v5s and being a big playmaker in these team fights on things like Wukong, on things like Maokai, he looks a lot more successful than when he has to play early and when he has to play skirmish-oriented styles. It's really just not what he's good at, and unfortunately for him, that's kind of the meta right now, and it's not like he's not going to run into the best junglers in the world at this tournament. Even in, like, the play-in stage, he's probably going to have to play against a Bilibili team that wants to skirmish all the time. That's their whole thing, and I just don't know how Skewmond's going to be able to hold up in that environment. I think that there is a chance he comes out and is actually just really, really good at this tournament, because that's the kind of upside he has as a, you know, a late-game team fighter. If he can survive the early game, hell, if he can even thrive in the early game, which I think is totally possible from a mechanical perspective, from a, you know, a mentality perspective, I think it's more of a question mark, but Skewmond has the talent to be able to dominate internationally in the early game. If he's going to come out and do that on things like Xin Zhao and Vi and Pantheon and these other picks that are really valuable, then yeah, things are going to get a lot better for G2, but like, I can't guarantee that that's going to happen, even if I think it is possible. So for now, he does come in as my number 7 jungler at this tournament, and again, he was a big reason why they lost in the finals. He had no tempo into El Yoya, and that was a very big problem for G2. And then there's Labrov, who's just not been good this year. Like, there's really nothing else really to say. His playstyle fit on G2 is a nightmare, and I'm not blaming it entirely on Labrov or on G2 or whatever. I think this is a really bad fit between these two. I think Labrov is a team fighter. He was a really big 5v5 engage threat on BDS last year. They were playing for Ice to be able to win every single front to back, and Labrov was kind of the facilitator for that, and that's why he had such a gigantic breakout year. They're asking him to do something completely different. They're asking him to be the primary skirmish engager player, which first of all, supports aren't supposed to do anyways, but specifically Labrov is not very good in that role. They've been asking him to do that all year, and he's just not very good at doing that. And if they're going to continue to ask him to do that, which I don't really see them changing in any way, because Skumond is not a skirmish player. He doesn't really want to be doing that. And Caps and Broken Blade actually do want to skirmish. Hansama does want to skirmish a lot. If Labrov is still going to be asked to be the guy that ends up giving his life in a lot of these instances, then I think you're going to find that he's really not going to be all that successful in that role. And G2 in general is not going to be all that successful playing that style. Again, until they show that they're going to be able to change that up, their inconsistencies will remain. This was a team that was the 4th seed going into the playoffs for a reason. I get they won winners finals. I get that they looked like a team that was, going to be able to reclaim their spot atop EU. There's a reason they got blasted in finals as well. I say blasted. They won a game. It's not like they got swept, but there was a reason that it wasn't particularly close. Why KOI was the better team by a large margin. And it's because I think this team is still trying to find whatever the hell they want to be, like in terms of a play style. The fact that they're at MSI goes to show just how inconsistent the LEC generally is, and I've talked about that all year long. A team like G2 has no business being at an international tournament, not because they don't have the talent, but because they don't have the direction in order to be an international team right now. They've had a ton of time off since the end of the LEC. They've had 2 full patches since then to try and figure out what they want to do. There's a chance they come out here, they have a very clear identity, every single player is on the same page, and they're able to be a top 4 or 5 team at this tournament. They have the talent to do that, but I need to see it on tape before I just believe that all of the things that we've seen in the LEC, the lack of direction and the lack of ideas, are just going to magically fix themselves overnight. Then moving on to number 6 now in my power rankings, and this was a little bit easier. Now that we've gotten G2 out of the way, I have a pretty clear idea of where the rest of these Western teams stand. So coming in at number 6 for me, it is going to be Movistar KOI, the number 1 seed from the LEC, the defending LEC champions. And to me, they have a slight edge over G2 just because I think that their playstyle might just translate a little bit better to international competition right now. I think they're kind of the opposite of G2 in a lot of ways, which is why I think it makes them really interesting as parallels. We just got done talking about how G2 is this ridiculously talented team with a lot of good players that doesn't really have a direction for how they want to play the game. It feels like a lot of their players end up clashing in terms of their style, and they haven't really found where they want to put a lot of their resources consistently to try to maximize the talent they have on the team, whereas I think the opposite has happened for KOI. This is a team that at times can struggle because they really have like one way to win the game. Like they really do have one major style, one major game plan. When it works, it looks great, and when it doesn't work, it can be a little bit of a problem for them. It's why they've been such an inconsistent team over the course of 2025, but we saw what it looked like when it worked at its high-end level, at the top level, which obviously we will get into, but let's go ahead and go over the roster. Their lineup is looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Jojo Pune in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. A lot of good to talk about with this team. Quite frankly, a lot of good in terms of the mechanics and the skill level. I think that's what kind of goes under the radar, is it's not that this team is lacking in the talent level. I think that's what a lot of people were kind of assuming for a long time in the LEC when they were kind of the perennial 4th place team throughout the beginning of the year, where it was like, well, they're good, but are they good enough to be able to compete with top 1, top 2 teams in the LEC from a talent perspective? I was always saying that the answer to that was yes. I just was concerned because they really are pretty one-dimensional in terms of how they play the game. They grew out of that a little bit over the course of their playoff run to get here, but I still think they very much like one particular style, and it all centers around their North American mid laner, their Canadian mid laner, who's coming home for MSI, and that is Jojo Pune. He's really the main character of KOI. Whether or not he's the one getting all the resources or not, he is the one who dictates whether or not this team has a chance to be able to win games, because his form is so streaky, it's so feast or famine. The games he pops off in, or more specifically the games where he's able to express his tempo in the mid lane and move around with Elyoya and allow the bot lane to really start playing very aggressive, those games are very hard to beat KOI in. Like, they are a very good team in that regard. But the problem is, Jojo Pune sometimes does lose tempo in the mid lane. He's not always the most consistent 1v1 laner, and when he loses very hard, and in those games, it honestly does not matter what happens elsewhere on the map. KOI is almost always going to lose those games, and so it really ends up being a situation where Jojo wins, KOI wins. Jojo loses, KOI loses, and it makes it very difficult to try and evaluate this team, because I think there is a lot of talent elsewhere, but the style that Jojo ends up bringing ends up making them such a polarizing team anyways. I think he has found a bit more of that like secondary carry gear over the course of their playoff run, where Elyoya and Supa in particular really got a lot more shine, a lot more resources. Supa was incredible in their playoff run, which we will get to. Elyoya really started to step up. if JoJo can unlock that part of him that can be a secondary carry, if he's not just either the #1 guy or they lose the game, then I think KOI absolutely has the potential to be a top 4, top 5 team, as we've been saying for G2, for the Flying Oysters, for everybody in this B tier. You have the opportunity, if everything goes right, to be able to make that ascent, but I think JoJo is the biggest piece of the puzzle, and his international performance, I think, is really going to show a lot for what KOI's upside actually looks like. But that brings us to the players we've already kind of talked about a little bit here. Elyoya, Supa, and Alvaro are the 3 that I want to kind of combo talk about next, because I do think a lot of the conversation around those 3 should be in similar veins. We'll start with Supa and Alvaro because they're the consistent piece of this team. They were good last year for a Mad Lions team that desperately needed some sort of stability. They were the part of the team that was locking it down in the regular season that ended up giving them a chance to go on that miracle run in the regional qualifier to get to Worlds. And obviously, Supa and Alvaro were really good at the World Championships, the best players in the play-in stage at Worlds, and were pretty solid elsewhere. The entire team wasn't. There were definitely some flaws and some problems, but I'm all in on Supa and Alvaro. They're the best Western bot lane right now. I think in terms of just production and performance, I think that there are some others that have conversations to be there. I think specifically Fnatic obviously should be in that conversation. Upset and Mickey were excellent, even if the rest of the team was not. Shout out Razork and Humanoid. I think Team Liquid still very much deserves to be in that conversation with Yon and Core. Again, just because the rest of the team ended up underperforming doesn't mean it was entirely their fault. But in terms of just raw consistency, Supa and Alvaro remind me so much of Cloud9's bot lane of Sven and Vulcan, where the high-end plays are just ridiculously good, and the low end is still pretty darn good. Like, they just don't have these horrid games. They're always really in it, and they're always up in gold, and they're always doing good things, at least domestically, and I really don't see any reason for that not to translate internationally, especially because I think bot lane is the weakest role out of the teams that are going to be trying to fight for top 5. I think bot lane is where KOI can probably make their biggest difference if they can start to play the style they played in the playoffs more efficiently, which was playing for Supa a lot more, allowing him to be the primary carry and to dominate a lot of these games. If that's going to be their style, I think that might even be their most successful way to play at MSI in particular, with how inconsistent a lot of the other bot lanes can be, especially in the 2v2 and in the early skirmishes. So excited to see that. Supa's just a really stable player. Varus, Ezreal, Kai'Sa, whatever you need him to play, he can play. I've always been a really big fan of his game, but he has backed me up on that tenfold with how he's played in recent years. So excited for Supa. Alvaro is also a menace. You could argue that Alvaro is even better than Supa in terms of his high-end plays. I think as a playmaker, you know, in a Rel or Rakan capacity, again, playmaking, kind of the name of the game for supports who got here. In that capacity, he's probably the best Western support at doing those things. He's not always the most consistent in terms of being able to set up team fights or playing patient. That's where he can sometimes falter a bit as a player, but in the aggressive scenarios or even playing from behind, like finding unique creative angles, he's excellent there. He honestly reminds me of like a Western Crisp in terms of the way that he plays the game, and I really like saying that. That is a big positive. I don't mean that in any sort of negative capacity. But then there is Elyoya, and you do have to talk about Elyoya. He's a very hard player to try and evaluate. The playoff run that they went on, like their finals showcase against G2 and generally their wins over K-Corp, Elyoya was a monster. He was finals MVP for a reason. This guy was absolutely unreal, and he is one of, if not the biggest reason why KOI is here at MSI in the first place. And Elyoya has been a player that on this channel I've ranked as the #1 jungler in Europe for basically the last 3 years in a row. Like, he is somebody that I've just said at a high-end level, he does all of the good things the best of any of the European junglers. The problem is that he is very quietly crazy inconsistent. Like, even on a game-to-game basis. I know that's just what European junglers do. Like, there aren't European junglers who are just good every game. Jankos was the last one who even had a chance to be that, and even he was inconsistent at times. But Elyoya is just, he's the kind of player where if he wins incredibly hard. He's really good at playing from ahead. He's also good at playing from behind, but there are just some games where he just doesn't even try, or it feels like the mental is turned off. We kind of saw that at Worlds last year, especially once they got out of the play-in stage. It certainly was the case in the regular season. They got to Worlds in spite of Elyoya in 2024, but you know, there are really good moments as well. Again, the playoff run was really good. You're just hoping that that consistency can drive his way through. I'm still a big fan of his game, and I think when he is on, like when he's clicking and when everything's working, he's probably, you know, right up there as one of the better Western junglers in the entire world right now, you know, with Inspired and, you know, whoever you want to put in that conversation as well with him. But, you know, the inconsistencies do worry me, and I think he's going to need to just have a good tournament for this team to find the success that they're looking for. And then they have Mirwin on the top side. don't need even to follow the channel to know my thoughts on Mirwin. If you've heard me talk throughout this video, you probably know how I feel about Mirwin. I will say I'm much higher on him in 2025 than I was in 2024. I was really low on this guy. Last year, I thought that he was actively dragging his team down and holding them back. He could only really play counter picks. He was not particularly useful in basically any other capacity. However, he has gotten better at the more meta top laners, I think specifically because the meta has kind of moved into a direction that he's more comfortable with, playing a lot of Gwen and Rumble, the two best champions in the game. The Mbessa and the Cassante have also gotten a lot better. The Mbessa in particular has been a very big pick for Mirwin, but he's still going to come in as a 9 because when he's playing these meta champions and meta matchups against good top laners, he still kind of gets blasted more often than he wins. Like, he's not a particularly good top laner at being a top laner. Now, when he pulls out Varus top, when he pulls out Vex top, when he pulls out Nico top, or whatever, bullshit, quite frankly, all due respect, because I love the picks and I think it makes it really fun. But whenever he pulls out these crazy top lane picks, he ends up becoming a completely different player, and it lets him unlock a side of him that ends up letting him be very valuable to the team. The problem is that's not translated internationally. He's never been valuable, or at least he wasn't valuable for this team internationally last year, and I see no reason for that to change, especially because top lane right now at this tournament is by far the deepest position. I think it's really the only role in the entire tournament where you can't really see one player where you're just like even Guigo for Furia is like playable. You know what I mean? In terms of his aggressiveness, his mechanics are really good. Mirwin is not a player that I really believe in at the same level. Do I think he's worse than Kiaya? Yes. Do I think he's worse than like Driver? Yes. Like, I don't think Mirwin is on their level in terms of his ability to play out an entire series. Are there going to be games where he is as effective as a top 2 or a top 3 top laner at this tournament, where he's able to beat players that are way better than him? Absolutely. And I'm expecting that to happen. There are going to be 1 or 2 games this tournament where he pops off and actually just carries KOI to a victory. Are there going to be games where he looks like he's unplayable at this level? I think that also is going to happen, and that inconsistency just drops him to number 9, and that kind of highlights why I think KOI is not the best Western team right now, even though I think their playstyle is starting to expand a little bit more. I love Supa and Alvaro. I think Jojo is a very good player. Mid lane's a good position at this tournament, and Jojo is right there. And Oyoya's in really good form right now, but with Mirwin being very inconsistent on the top side, with Oyoya being a player that can have a stinker at any moment, and this team relying so much on Jojo Pune, I just can't within good conscience say that this is the best Western team from the tape that we've seen. I expect them to do fine, but if this team ended up finishing in 8th and being the worst team in the actual main stage of MSI, I'm not going to be all that surprised. I also wouldn't be shocked if they were the team that randomly went on a run like K-Corp did at first stand. I think they have that kind of upside too. I think their range of outcomes is maybe even wider than a team like G2 or even a team like the Flying Oysters. I could theoretically see their low end being even lower than those other teams, but I just believe in the talent that I believe in a little too much. If this team can still play around this bot lane, I think bare minimum, they should be a top 6 team at this tournament. But that brings us to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is, I guess, me making a little bit of a statement. I've been pretty pleasantly surprised to see that this has been a pretty unanimous choice for a lot of people, but in my opinion, the best team in the West right now is FlyQuest, and they come in at number 5 in my MSI power rankings, the number 1 representative, of course, from the LTA, the winners of the LTA North. I think they are the top of this tier, although, like I said, I think this grouping of 4 teams of FlyQuest, Movistar KOI, G2, and the Flying Oysters, I think all of them can basically be put in whatever order you want, whatever order you feel is best. But right now, I feel pretty confident that FlyQuest is the 5th best team based on tape at this tournament. Will that end up proving to be correct? I have no idea. Obviously, all of these teams can over or underperform at any given moment, but for the hometown representatives, I think it's pretty cool to say that, at least in terms of expectations, it's pretty clear that a lot of people actually have them as the best team in the West right now. And I definitely would agree with that. Anybody who watched my LTA finals analysis would know that I agree with that, whether or not they liked that take at the time or not. So let's go ahead and go over why I believe that. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Whippo in the top lane, Inspired in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Masu at AD carry, and Busio at support. Some pluses and minuses to go with this team. This certainly isn't a team that is without flaws. I think that there are a couple of players here that I would be concerned about from a pure mechanical perspective or like an all-around game perspective going international, but some players I definitely wouldn't, and that is honestly led by Inspired in the jungle, who at this point has proven himself to be the best Western jungler of all time. I don't even think it's really all that debatable anymore. He is the reigning MVP in the LTA, whether or not I would have personally given that to him or not. I would have given it to his teammate Busio personally myself, but it's just how high I was on how Busio played a lot of this year. But Inspired is still spectacular. He is the only Western player to break through the top 4 in any role here. He's going to get 4th in terms of my jungle rankings, and you can probably guess why he's the one to break through. Not just because I do believe that right now he's the best Western player, because I do believe right now he is the best Western player, but even outside of that, I think that, jungle is one of those positions where usually the top 4 feel pretty impenetrable. There's one jungler that definitely isn't quite on the same level as the others at this tournament, and I think Inspired is better than Beishwan, and that's why he is coming in at number 4 in terms of these rankings. But the Xin Zhao, the Sejuani, the Pantheon, whatever it ends up being, whether he wants to play for early skirmishes, which is something he wasn't always really good at. Let's not forget that he used to actually be a player that was considered too slow, like too late game oriented to be considered the best Western jungler of all time. He has definitely sped up his pace. He's been very good on Xin Zhao this year, but the Pantheon has also been by far the best in North America in terms of his execution on that champion. But when he does still get to play things like Sejuani, if he is willing to pull out some of the more signature picks, things like the Viego or the Lilia that he's played a lot over the course of his career, that's kind of the bread and butter of Inspired. But really at this point, he's just a super well-rounded, very talented jungler. He's got a great mind for the game. He's always in the right spot. He's a phenomenal team fighter, probably the best in the role, like maybe in the entire world. Like obviously there are others that are maybe a bit more technical about it, but Inspired really is a maestro in terms of how to play 5v5s, especially when he gets on those carry-oriented junglers. Like I think the best case scenario, you look at someone like Skewmond and you're like, I hope someday he can be like 75% of what Inspired is. That's kind of the dream for a player like Skewmond. That just goes to show where Inspired is at. He has more than earned his B+ ranking in the jungle, and I think he is the biggest asset that this FlyQuest team has. Also, worth noting, this guy has had a ton of international success, both on Rogue and on FlyQuest. He's been to the quarterfinals of Worlds multiple times, and has performed pretty well in that environment, has actually been able to step up in quite a few of those games. So I'm really not particularly worried about him underperforming. I think he's been perfectly fine as an international player. And then I think you start talking about Bwipo and Busio, the other two players that really stepped up over the course of the spring split. Bwipo was, in my opinion, the best top laner in the LTA over the course of this past split, although Thanatos was really good for Cloud9. Bwipo was really excellent, and I think he somehow goes under the radar for just how good he is and how valuable he is to what FlyQuest actually want to do. He is much more risky than a player like Inspired or even a player like Busio ends up being for this team. He probably is the biggest point of excitement for the team because there are multiple games that he just instantly wins, and even when he's super far behind in games, he's often making really positive plays overall, but also he does get behind in a lot of these games by overreaching, by dying to ganks, by not properly warding. It's the little things that sometimes end up catching up to Bwipo. That's always just kind of been the case because he starts thinking 14 steps ahead and forgets to double check for plan, B, and ends up getting caught out a little bit. For the most part, it ends up being fine because FlyQuest is really good at capitalizing elsewhere on the map when teams put pressure into Bwipo, but at the end of the day, that can be a plus and a minus, and I think internationally, that can be something that theoretically could be exploited a bit more, but this is a former world finalist. This is somebody who obviously has a ton of experience playing at a top level, and he's in great form right now. He was in great form last year as well, but I think he might be even better right now in terms of what he can do, especially because I don't think a lot of top laners are going to be sharing champion pools with someone like Bwipo, and that really helps for fearless best of fives. It's almost underrated how important that is to be able to be like, well, I know that going into game 3 or 4, if we haven't picked Gragas, it's probably not off the board. If we haven't picked Renekton, it's probably not off the board. They're not considered the highest priority top laners in the game at the current moment. So Bwipo, I think, is an asset, and you guys know how I feel about Busio this year. I think this is his true, tier 1 breakout. I've always thought he was a good player, but the way I labeled him going into 2025 was that classic B+, your classic, at least domestic B+, your classic, international B- kind of player, where it's he's good, he's not, a problem, he's actively adding to his team's success, and he can be the 4th or 5th best player on a team that goes to Worlds, but he's likely not going to be the player that ends up getting them to, a championship domestically. That's not really how I've ever viewed Busio. I never thought that he was going to be if he was the number 1 support in the region, I think that it would have had more to say about the region than it would about Busio individually as a player. He has emerged over the course of this split as a true playmaker and really the dynamic piece of this team. Everyone gives a lot of credit to Inspired for creating a lot of what FlyQuest do. I don't agree with that. I think Busio is the primary creator for FlyQuest. I think he is the one that creates a lot of the action that this team ends up playing through, and he's one of the big reasons why this team is here in the first place. Of course, he was great in the playoffs, as he almost always is, but to me, he was regular season MVP, and I think he is arguably the best Nico player at this entire tournament. Makes sense, he's a converted mid laner going down to the support position, but This guy's awesome, and if you wanted to rank him above Alvaro, I totally get it. Like, I didn't. I think Alvaro's a little bit more proven just in terms of the long-term success. I think Alvaro was better last year than Busio, and Alvaro was awesome in the playoffs as well. But Busio, in terms of just, like, 2025 form, if you just ignore everything else and just look at the tape from the spring split, is probably the best Western support right now, and that's a really big plus to him. That's how good he was in the LTA, and that core of Inspired, Bwipo, and Busio is really solid. And when you're looking at Quad and Masu as the players that I have the most concerns about, that's kind of a good thing for FlyQuest. Masu is a player who really was awesome in the playoffs and was great in the finals against Cloud9, a big reason why they ended up winning that series. My only concern with Masu is just that he wasn't really all that dominant in the regular season. For most of the spring split, he was kind of the passenger, if you will, on this team. I just wasn't really all that impressed with the way that Masu was playing. I certainly don't think he was as good as he was in summer of last year, even really in winter of this year. I just wasn't really watching his tape and being like, Masu is doing so much to really push this team forward in the way that players like Supa were, even a Hansama was for G2, but he ends up emerging above Hansama because I think personally his style being the opposite of Hansama, that being Masu being much more of a late game carry, somebody who wants to play for 5v5 team fights rather than, you know, a Hansama who wants to play for 2v2 lane. I think that that's just better for the meta and specifically better for his team because he doesn't really have to get a lot of resources in the early game in order to be useful, but he was also really, really good when they needed him the most in the playoffs, and that really elevated him back up to the number 680 carry at this tournament. You know, he's not a weak link. He is somebody who has shown he can step up internationally. He almost beat Gen.G at Worlds last year. Like, I'm not going to say it would have been entirely him. Everybody on the team played well, but Masu was awesome in that series, was the best player on FlyQuest in that series, and, you know, if that would have happened, who knows how the narrative would have changed. But then you have Quad in the mid lane, and again, like, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer when it comes to Quad. I like Quad as a player, and he's really impressed me, especially over the past few months. I think his 2025 has really shown me that he's grown a lot since his time in the LCK, because when he was in the LCK, he was just a very selfish player, not in terms of like mentality, but in terms of gameplay style. Like, he was going to sit in lane, farm up, and then hopefully win team fights in the back half of the game, and I don't think he is that anymore. I think he's much more willing to try and play with Inspired, and I think he is going to try and affect the map. I just think he relies so much on his mechanical skill that that could be something that doesn't translate quite as well internationally. We saw it work last year because he was able to pull out some counter picks in big series against, you know, Chovy and Gen.G, you know, a very good friend of his and a player he's played against a ton. I don't know if the same could be said going into 2025. We'll have to see. I just think mid lane's really good. If you think Quad is better than either JoJo or Caps, I'm not really going to be all that upset by that. You know, that's why Hongq ends up coming in at number 8. I think Hongq's a really good player, but I can't say that Hongq's better than Quad. Like, that's a really hard statement to make, and I really like JoJo and Caps. I think their upside's a little bit higher than Quad's is individually as a player, but again, if those are your weak links, like, yeah, this is the best team in the West right now, and their tape absolutely backs that up. They kind of combine the strengths of KOI and G2, where they have the mechanical skill and the top-end talent with players like Inspired and Bwipo and Busio that can really carry through, and, you know, they have a clear direction, kind of like KOI does. And so, you know, it's one of those teams that I think is pretty clearly just better than a lot of the teams that are around them in the LTA. We'll see if that translates to playing well on the international stage. This is really the proof of, like, okay, is NA the third best region in the world? Because I think me and a lot of other people have kind of been saying that it's, you know, 3A, 3B rather than 3 and 4 for a little while. I think NA and EU have been on even footing for basically 2-ish years in a row now, and this is, I think, NA's chance to really, for the first time ever, kind of come out on top definitively if they can have the best team at this tournament. It's going to be hard to really prove that with the format, but I think if any team so far in the past couple of years has had the talent and the tape to be able to back up that sentence, it's absolutely this version of FlyQuest. But then we get to move on to number 4 in my power rankings, and this is where the comments are going to start rolling in, as they always do for this team. Number 4 for me is going to be T1. And you'll notice, first of all, before you start getting really angry at me, I have a couple of caveats to throw out for this, but you'll notice we went from B, from number 8 to number 5. They were all within the B tier. We've jumped all the way up to A-. I think that there is no B+ in this sense at this tournament. Maybe FlyQuest is about as close as it gets, but I think Fly is closer to being what KOI, G2, and Flying Oyster are than they are to being, like, way better than them. And the top 4 are just way better than everybody else. Like, it's not particularly close. These are the 4 best teams at this tournament, and if they perform in any other order, it's going to be quite surprising. But let me justify having T1 at 4, because I think that there are a couple of things that are working against me having them at 4. First and foremost, if you're a T1 fan and you've already gone and yelled at me in the comments, first off, thank you so much. They help the algorithm. Comments are really good for these videos, but also, every single time I put T1 T1 below third, I believe, or like fourth at a tournament, they've won it. Like, that's just how it goes with T1. You honestly should be thanking me, because I might have just guaranteed that T1 wins MSI, which would be a really great outcome, but also I do kind of have to take into account the whole year worth of T1 if I want to try and rate where this team is at. And quite frankly, the year's worth of T1 has not been better than the year's worth of the other two LPL teams, despite what the LPL did at first stand. I think that that really is the other big caveat, the inherent idea that the LCK is just better than the LPL right now. I agree with that sentiment. I think that there was a time period throughout this year where I was like, oh, the top 4 in the LCK are better than anyone else in the world, specifically like in winter. When you were looking at Damwon being really good, T1 was really impressing, and then HLE and Gen.G were also incredibly successful. Gen.G was honestly looked at as the weakest of those teams at the time, but that was really a time period where I was like, oh, I think the 4 LCK teams are like the 4 best teams in the world. I don't know if that's the case anymore, man. I think the LCK has really... I think the LPL's gotten better, and I think the LCK has stagnated a bit, and I certainly think that that is the case near the top of the standings. Give me a chance to explain why. Let's go ahead and go over this team. Their lineup is like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. A very familiar lineup and roster to most people, but of course Doran now instead of Zeus on the top side for these T1 teams, with those 2 players swapping organizations. Zeus not being here is already a big surprise, and that's probably the first place to start when it comes to T1. They massacred Hanwha Life in this qualification series to get here. Remember, HLE won first stand, and it was not close. Like, they were not really tested at all at any point in that tournament. It felt like they were the best by a large margin and that nobody was really going to be able to match that. And you know what? T1 knocked that team like out of the water. Like, they 3-0'd them, and it wasn't particularly close. Like, none of the games were even remotely interesting. They were just better in a lot of different areas. And I think you can point at Doran and Keria having really good days, Owner, you know, stepping up and being better than Peanut, which definitely doesn't always happen domestically, and Faker and Guma being really solid as well. Guma had a great series overall there, but the thing about T1, and the reason that that was so surprising, is that T1, quite frankly, had been the clear number 3 team in the LCK all year long up until that point in the regular season. You saw it in the winter split when they lost to HLE in 5 games in the playoffs. Like, it just didn't really feel like T1 was the better team. They just got the better of HLE that day, and maybe they are the better team. It's just really hard for me to say that that's the case. The one player right now that I think is rising up to be on that level is Owner. I think Owner has just been unbelievably good all year long, and it's funny because Owner's the player that I'm usually the lowest on when it comes to T1. Like, historically speaking, when you go and watch my videos like this for previous years, it's like, okay, the bot lane's clicking. Gumayushi, especially in 2024, was like really carrying the team. Keria has most of the time just been the best support in the world. You know, top lane with Zeus always had the high-end upside. Faker's super stable in the mid lane, even if he doesn't always show it. Domestically speaking, it was Owner where I was like, well, he's kind of really benefiting from just being on T1 and getting to play with a lot of lanes that are constantly winning and a lot of very mechanically talented players. That's not been the case. He has been the elevator across 2025. He is the main character of T1 right now, and even when the team plays for other resources, you can still see that Owner's decisions and like the way that he wants to play out the early game, that's what affects what T1 wants to do. And so I think him stepping up and him being really good at this tournament, that's what's going to determine whether or not this team can get top 1 or top 2, which, by the way, I think is super doable. I'm not going to spoil things too much, but remember, 8 to 5 were all B tier, 4 to 2 are all A- tier. They're all in the same grouping. If you wanted T1 at number 2, grading wise, they basically come out at number 2. There's really not a huge difference in terms of the grades that I've given these players, but Owner is the biggest piece I think that will need to step up in order for T1 to kind of assert themselves to get there. I think he is going to do that, but there have been times where he's also been caught a little bit less successful. He's not the most consistent player in the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but consistency is not really a strength of this entire T1 team if you really want to go down that route. You've got Doran, who was unreal in this team's road to MSI or playoff run or whatever you want to call it. He decimated KT Rolster, and then he went out and absolutely destroyed Hanwha Life and Zeus as well. Kind of embarrassed Zeus in that series. And I get that Doran has always been a bit of like the Zeus kryptonite, if you really want to use that terminology, but it was surprising just how well Doran played towards the back half. He always steps up in those big best of 5s domestically, but Doran also has the reputation of not being great internationally. If that's going to continue on for T1, that's a bit of a problem because he really was a big piece, probably the biggest piece for why T1 was here in the first place. If Doran had gotten, you know, beaten by Zeus and HLE had a foothold in those games, perhaps things go differently, even with Owner kind of taking advantage of Peanut in the way that he did and Zeka just generally not playing well. You know, Doran was kind of the missing piece for T1 in that equation, and that's what really changed things. For now, I can't put him above number 4 just because of his past international woes, but he definitely is the kind of player that if he has one good tournament, like, we have so much good tape of Doran in the LCK. I'm very willing to throw out the bad international tape so long as he actually does show that he can win an international tournament. You've got Faker in the mid lane. Really not a lot to talk about when it comes to Faker, and I feel like that's a very weird thing to say. Is he the best mid laner in the world? No. Like, he comes in number 4 at this tournament, and I think from a pure mechanics and just raw performance perspective, there's really nowhere else to put him. In terms of these rankings, I don't think he's been quite as explosive as the 3 other top mid laners at this tournament, but in terms of his impact on this team, it's right up there, probably at number 2 or number 3 in this tournament. Like, that's just where Faker is at. He's not going to dominate lane. He's not really going to be up a ton of gold, but is he going to be useful? And is he going to be clutch? Yes. Like, that's what Faker does. That's what Faker always does. Not really a lot to talk about. You know who Faker is. He's basically been the same player over the past year and a half as he is right now. And then there's Guma and Keria, and this is the big positive point for T1. Guma and Keria were not good in the regular season. I really don't care what anybody says. I saw some flack on social media for people putting Keria at like 2nd or 3rd in their support rankings. I have him at number 4 in my support rankings because, quite frankly, for most of 2025, he's not even been a top 3 support in the LCK. Like, it's really just not looked particularly good for Keria. There have been a lot of games that have just not gone his way, and Guma has also just kind of been a complete non-factor for T1 in the regular season. But things have gotten slowly better and better and better. I think kind of the general vibe around this team has gotten better after Guma has just been reinserted as the full-time starter. The drama surrounding him and Smash and just whatever they want to do in that department has started to go away, at least a little bit, and that's opened up the door for, I think, the bot lane to start to feel a bit more comfortable again. In their playoff run, again, their road to MSI run, these two were lights out. Keria was unbelievably good against Hanwha Life, completely gapped Delight, and just completely destroyed Viper in terms of how those games went. And Guma was excellent in those games as well. He was kind of the primary damage carry in a lot of those games, even if Doran and Keria were doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Like, Guma was excellent, especially against KT Rolster, where he was really, really great. So if these two are going to step up and be a top 2 or 3 bot lane in the world again, which is super possible, then T1, yeah, is going to be a top 2 team. Because even with Doran underperforming, if you have a good version of Owner, a good version of Guma, a good version of Keria, and then Faker normally stepping up like he does internationally, this team is going to be just fine. But those are more questions than I have about those other teams. Their floor is just inherently lower because their form has been so inconsistent, I should say, throughout the entirety of the year. Again, I think their best form is what we saw most recently, which is a really good sign. If they show that again, this team is going to be just fine. If you want them top 2, I really have no problem with that for now. They come in at number 4, but the upside we know is there for T1. But now we get to move on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is probably the team that most people are going to have 4th, and honestly, I do kind of agree with that in terms of the tape, but I just can't put them there. I think they're going to do well here. It's Bilibili Gaming, the number 2 seed from the LPL, coming in at number 3 for me. Again, I totally understand why a lot of people are probably going to have them 4th in their power rankings, but the quality of players on this team is just so ridiculously high that even if they haven't been able to show that they're like a team that deserves to be near the top of the world, they did last year with one different player in the jungle, and I get that Beichuan is not, you know, Shun in terms of what he is, and he's not even really Wei in terms of being like, you know, a carry player. Like, the mechanics aren't there, but the mental is so much better for this team with Beichuan in there as the starting jungler, and I still think that there is some potential in this team that is yet to be fully realized, and it could be MSI that kind of pulls it out of them. We've seen, you know, Bilibili as an organization, you know, really emerge at MSI like they did in 2023. We'll see if they have the opportunity to do that again here, but let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their lineup is looking like Bin in the top lane, Beichuan in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, Elk at AD carry, and On at support. Again, most of these players international fans are going to be familiar with, even if you haven't watched the LPL over the course of this year. Most notably, Knight in the mid lane, who is still getting an A+ grade for me. The only thing to say when it comes to Knight is that he didn't start off 2025 ridiculously hot. For a lot of the beginning of the spring split, he was just kind of really good. He wasn't like the best player in the league, but over the second half of the split, he was the best player in the league, and it wasn't particularly close again, and I think a lot of people gave him MVP votes because of that. He was second in MVP voting for a lot of people I know on the LPL English broadcast, including me, and he also was really good in the playoffs for this team, but that kind of brings up the other caveat. He was not very good in the finals against anyone's legend. That was the one series where it really did feel like he wasn't particularly strong, and that's not a great time for him to underperform. It's not really a great showcase that in the biggest of moments, that's when he started to falter individually as a player. Again, I do want to say that I believe in Knight, and I believe we've seen him step up super consistently. You have to remember, this is a guy who was, like, collecting LPL titles like they were, you know, minions in a game at one point. Like, that's how successful he was domestically. I'm not worried that he can't live up to the hype, that he can't win the big moment. He's already won MSI on JD Gaming in 2023, so we know he can do it again. It's just, he's going to have to step up and be that guy that I know he can be in order for this team to be what I think they are at this tournament. I'm kind of betting on that being the case. I'm betting on him being the second best player at this tournament, which is why I have BLG at number 2. But it's not like the rest of this team is built on slouches or anything like that. You've still got Bin in the top lane, and while Bin has definitely had a less great year than he has over the past 2 years, it's still been very good. You know, I've been like dying on the Bin as the best top laner hill since 2023. People called me crazy for that at the beginning of 2024. Go back and look at like my comments on the LPL offseason grades video and see how people reacted to me calling Bin the best top laner in the world over Zeus after he won Worlds for the first time. People were not happy about that, but it aged incredibly well. It's really just been 2025 where it's not been super consistent. And honestly, even then, like a lot of the problems that Bin had were once again at the beginning of the split before Beishwan came in to replace Wei in the jungle. It really kind of does feel like Bin has started to step back into his own shoes. Now, is he quite as dominant as he has been in the past? No. Is he spamming the hell out of Yorick in the top lane and then teleporting into every fight? Yes. And that is a bit of a concern for me, but he is one of the few players that actually will like win fights for his team out of the top lane position just without really any assistance, and I still believe him to be an S-tier player in terms of mechanical talent. It's all really about whether or not he can put it together. I'm even being a little bit passive and only putting him as a B+ coming into this tournament, but that's good enough to be above the other 2 top laners that are kind of fighting it out in that B+ range in Flandra and in Doran, who I think are also relatively inconsistent. But the solo lane duo might be the most talented at the entire tournament. That's how good these two can be when they are on point. And that's why it's just so hard for me to put this team below 3rd, even though they haven't really showcased it in the same kind of way that maybe you would want. Elk and On are also starting to get into form. On was incredible, probably this team's best player in the playoffs. He was really good and a big reason why they ended up getting top 2 in the first place. I think he's going to go under the radar because, you know, he's not the most flashy player on this team, but On is so integral to what they do. Elk was also playing much better down the stretch of the regular season, although I've been much lower on Elk's actual 2025 performance than I am on Bin or Knight or On or any of these other players, and also apparently than everybody else in the community. I really have not been crazy impressed by how Elk has played the game over the past couple of months, but it's Elk. He was the best AD carry in the entire world last year in terms of production. Like, he can be there in terms of what he's putting out, and I think, you know, even at his worst, he's still been better, in my opinion, from a pure production standpoint than someone like Gumayushi on T1 across this year, and so I still believe in Elk as a top 280 carry at this tournament, and all of that kind of comes together, and you're like, wow, you're kind of hyping them up as like a potential top 1, top 2 kind of team at this tournament. What's holding them back? Well, Beichuan a little bit in the jungle. He's going to come in as my number 5 ranked jungler. Again, he's the only player from the LPL or the LCK to not be top 4 in their individual role, and that's a bit of a problem. Beichuan is a very easy evaluation for those of you who have maybe never watched the LPL or don't watch my LPL content. He's a very easy evaluation. Really great decision maker. He is a macro god in terms of the way that he's able to dictate where he wants to go. He's super smart about how he plays the early game, very smart as a team fighter, really great at being able to make quick, concise calls in terms of objectives, and is not afraid to skirmish in the early game if he understands that he's in a positive space to do so. And that's been the biggest advantage for BLG, is that Wei was a very selfish player, quite frankly, in terms of him wanting to get a lot of resources for himself. Think what we just talked about with someone like Gen.G for the Flying Oysters, even though Gen.G is not necessarily like the same player. I think they're similar players in terms of playstyle, where Wei might be considered more of a late game team fighter and he wants to play slower, but he does so in a way where he wants to win the game. He wants to be the one to go out there and actively kind of take a team across the finish line. Even someone like Inspired, I think, is a fair comparison for how Wei was playing, and that just took a lot of agency out of players like Knight, out of players like On and Bin, who, you know, let's face it, should be the ones who are driving Bilibili forward. Taking the agency out of their hands was not making this team better, and so you bring in Beichuan, who, yes, is significantly worse mechanically, and that really is the downside, is quite frankly, he's not even a top, like, 8 or 9 jungler in the LPL, mechanically speaking. He's just not that great of a fighter. He really doesn't understand how to team fight at a super high level, but he's really smart. Bringing that into BLG, it might not be a better player for BLG, but it's been better for this team, and they've gotten a lot better because of it, because it's allowed players like Knight and On and Bin and Elk to actually start being the best players in the world again, and to not feel like they have to limit themselves in order to make their jungler feel more comfortable. Also, this team has gotten way more aggressive in the early game, and so you know, Beishwan being listed as the number 5 jungler, it shouldn't really be considered too much of a worrying trend. I think if you wanted to put BLG at 4 just because Beishwan is probably the weakest link of any player in the top 4, then I think that that's fair. But again, I think his role on the team ends up really hiding the fact that he's not as mechanically talented, and I think if you are going to get the best versions of Knight and Bin and On and Elk, it's probably not going to matter. That team is probably top 2 at this tournament in terms of what they can offer, but at least from what we've seen on the tape, this is the middle ground for me. If you wanted them at number 4, them and T1, I'm not joking, had a 0.004 grade difference in my ranking calculator that ended up giving Bilibili the edge. Seriously, if you want T1 at 3 and BLG at 4, I think that that's totally understandable. It's just for me, I'm trusting Knight. Like, I really do believe that that's where I want to put my faith and my resources, and we'll see if that ends up being something that pays off or ends up blowing back in my face. But then moving on to number 2 in my power rankings, and honestly, you can probably guess who number 2 is by process of elimination at this point, because number 1 is kind of everyone's number 1 until proven otherwise. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be anyone's legend, the number 1 seed from the LPL champions this previous split. I do have them second in my rankings. Again, I want to make it abundantly clear, they have the same exact grade as a team like T1. If you really wanted to make the argument that T1 was better than anyone's legend, I would listen to it. The LCK is a better region right now than the LPL. I just think T1 in particular have a couple of flaws, and that's why they end up falling to number 4. And AL, for all of their own issues, they are a team that, you know, I've gotten to cast quite a few of their games this year, very luckily, on LPL English, and what I've said there is kind of translated throughout a lot of the split, which is that they are all individually phenomenal players, very talented players, and yet somehow they are all still more than the sum of their parts. That's how good this team is. To me, they are a top 3 team in the world at bare minimum. They're the only team in this ranking that you cannot put below 3rd. Like, there is no universe in which they are worse than the 3rd best team at this tournament. 3 is their floor, because at the bare minimum, they're better than Bilibili Gaming, and they've proven that. They beat them in 5 games in winners finals, and then they kind of destroyed them in grand finals, really putting up like a very dominant showing to win their LPL championship, their first ever LPL championship, and get their first ever international appearance. You know, if you follow the channel, you know it's a big deal for me because I've been a big supporter of this organization and for players like Tarzan and KL for a very long time on this channel. But let's not just talk about what they've done. Let's talk about what they will do, because there's no reason to believe that they're going to be slowing down as of right now. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Flandra in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Shanks in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and KL at support. Again, some familiar faces, but maybe some unfamiliar faces for those of you who don't watch the LPL, and trust me, I get it. There's a lot of LPL that happens. I understand maybe not watching all of it. I'm a psychopath, so I'm able to do it, but some players with some international experience here, notably the top side of the map, both Flandra and Tarzan. Tarzan, obviously, very familiar in recent memory to basically every LoL esports fan. He was the driving force on a team that made the semifinals of the World Championships last year in Weibo Gaming. He did the same thing for LNG the previous year, and, you know, maybe he wasn't like the only player playing well, shout out Scout, on that team, but was certainly a very big part of their success and why they were able to find it. And then Flandra, a former world champion on this team, of course, with Edward Gaming. He has found his own set of success and his own kind of narrative across his entire career, but these were players that were brought in the offseason to raise the floor and the ceiling of what anyone's legend could be, and they have absolutely succeeded. Tarzan, to me, is the best jungler in the world. He gets that number 1 ranking. He has the same grade as the other jungler, you know, in number 2, which you can guess who it is based on who is, of course, remaining in this conversation. But to me, Tarzan just does everything at an elite level. Again, it's the same conversation I've had with someone like Peanut for many years. I think they're very similar players in a lot of instances, and I'm not trying to say that they're clones of each other. Tarzan probably a bit better at like outright carries, but Peanut probably more stable, at least on facilitators, and has gotten to play for better teams over the course of his career. But what Tarzan does at such a high level is pick tempo setters, and he's really like the tempo god. There's really not a lot of other ways for me to describe describe how Tarzan ends up playing the game. He, at 15 minutes every single game, will somehow, some way make a play that ends up putting his team up 3k gold, and he'll do that because his setups into those big plays are just so consistent, and he does it on any kind of champion. You can see the early game champions here, things like Xin Zhao and Pantheon. He's been a big Neferi fan over the course of this year, as has the entirety of the LPL, and as the entire world should have been for a majority of this year, but he really made his name on things like Sejuani and Maokai and Zac and, you know, these champions that are mostly considered to be team fight tanks that kind of stand on the front line and try to neutralize things. Tarzan really made his name on those champions because he would play them like early game skirmishers, and he would have that ability to frontline in the late game. He would do such a good job at setting up and winning exchanges in the early part of the game on Sejuani that his laners would be super fed because he's an accelerated facilitator, and then he would still be Sejuani in the back half of the game, and it's very difficult to break through. That's Tarzan at an elite level, and he's continued to be that. I do think he's gotten more aggressive as he's, you know, started to play on teams that maybe surround him a bit more, right? Like, he's the main character of anyone's legend, as he was on Weibo Gaming last year, and so you're not surprised to see him pick up some more aggressive picks, but it's nice to see that he can still play those at a ridiculously high level. He might have had a couple of bad games here or there, but for me, he still is the best jungler in the world. As I've been saying for a little while now, this is not a new opinion for me. I really just think that highly of Tarzan. I think if he went back to the LCK like Peanut did after he left the LPL, I think he would go and prove that. But same thing for Flandre, who at times this year has kind of looked like the best top laner in the world. Now, I'm certainly not dying on that hill. He ends up coming in at number 3 at this tournament for me, but it's kind of everything for Flandre. He's really been the only other player besides Bin to have a lot of success on things like Yorick, but really it's been things like Sion and Ornn that have been really spectacular for him throughout this year, and you don't really think of weak side tank top when you think of Flandre. That's not really the playstyle that comes to mind for him as a player. He got known for things like Graves top during his Worlds run. I believe that was around the time that like tank Victor top ended up being like actually main relevant or something like that. I remember him playing that at a really high level. It's just a really interesting combination of champions for Flandre. He can kind of do a little bit of everything, and I think that growth into being such a stable top lane player has really accelerated what anyone's legend can do, because he really wasn't that for most of his career, and he certainly wasn't that last year for JD Gaming. So those two were brought in the offseason to kind of be the stabilizing presence of this team, but it's not like they didn't already have a great foundation, and that's where Shanks, Hope, and KL come in, where they've just been phenomenal. These are all players that were on this team last year, and again, international fans might not be as familiar, especially with Shanks and KL. Like, Hope, obviously, you know, has been to the semifinals of Worlds before on JD Gaming. He was a bit of an afterthought on that team, and I think a lot of people forgot about him in that role, and it's been a couple of years. I think it was 2021, I want to say, where that was the case, maybe 2022. It was one of those years where he ended up making the semifinals. But again, Hope has just been one of those players that I think has, you know, kind of gotten forgotten a little bit, and he deserves to be considered in that upper echelon. Quite frankly, the only thing that's keeping him at number 3 and not at number 2 or fighting for number 1 is just my preconceived notions of what Hope was going into the year. I just never really saw Hope as anything above like a good, not great AD carry. He has done everything he's been asked to do and then some across 2025. This is truly a breakout year for Hope, and if you want to make the argument that at least on paper he's been the best AD carry in the LPL for certain, but in the world, like, you know what, like, there is an argument to be made that from a production standpoint he deserves to be in that conversation. It's hard for me to say he's definitely better than Elk and that he's definitely better than Ruler, because those players just have a ridiculous track record, but Hope has been unreal, and this team enables him very consistently. He's the Varus guy, if you want to play style thing, by the way. He's kind of your jack-of-all-trades AD carry. He's good in every phase of the game, which is what makes it so easy to play around him. And then, you know, you've got Shanks and KL. We'll start with KL because he's the other phenomenal player on this team. Again, longtime fans know exactly how I feel about KL as a player, even going back to his days in the LCK, before he went over to the LPL when he was on that sandbox team with Prince, during his breakout with Krako, who was really playing really well at that time. Like, this is a guy who's always felt like he's been a bit overshadowed by really good players on his team, and I think it might be happening again, because right now he is the best support in the world, and I don't think it's particularly close in terms of consistency and production. Like, yes, Duro, Keria, Delight, like, they're all very good players, but I think what KL's able to do is just play through every phase of the game and control the map like no other support in the world is able to do. This has been a position I've been incredibly successful on calling my shot on over the course of my career, and, you know, KL might be the best example of that. On is another very good example of that, but specifically KL, who just has every trait and every tool necessary to be the best support in the world, and he does it on playmakers, he does it on engaged tanks, it doesn't really matter. Again, his mid-game control is just better than any other support in the world. You can argue that the team fighting and the laning, like maybe it's not quite as good as other supports, but I think the mid-game control is the most important part of playing support right now, and that's what he does better than anybody. And then you've got Shanks in the mid lane. Talk about somebody that LPL fans have been hoping and begging to get to an international tournament for quite a while. This was a guy who was mega stuck on a miserable WE team for so many years. He finally gets out of there to come over here to Anyone's Legend, and while he gets close last year, it's not able to kind of turn into anything. Here he is at his first ever international tournament as a champion in the LPL. This has been kind of a prodigal son in the LPL, where people have just been waiting for him to break out and become one of the better mid laners in the world. This is his chance to do so, even more so than a lot of the other mid laners we've seen come through the LPL. First of all, this is a young gun, at least all things considered, in terms of experience compared to like Scout or Xiaohu or, you know, whoever else, Yagao or whoever else has represented the LPL at international tournaments from the mid lane position, Knight as well. He's not only inexperienced, but he's also somebody that's gotten better every single year, and he's got a very aggressive and fun playstyle. The problem for Shanks for a very long time was the inconsistency, especially as splits went longer and longer. He would start off really hot and then get a little bit colder and a little bit colder until eventually just wasn't playing well down the stretch. It's kind of been the opposite this year. I think he's gotten better every single game, and it's really exciting to be able to see that. He finally has a jungler he can play with where he trusts how they're going to play the game and they can try and enable him. He loves to play team fighters in the back half of the game, but he also loves split pushing. That's a really big thing with Shanks as a player, and AL really want to play for that 1-3-1 style with Flandra and Shanks in side lanes because they can trust that Hope is going to be able to actually do a lot in the three-man lane if they do want to go for that, you know, macro-oriented style. And this team is very calculated and very controlled in that measure as well. AL just have so much going for them. This is absolutely a team you have to consider a threat to win this entire tournament. Do they feel like that? Maybe not, but again, this team is so much more than the sum of their parts, and their parts are already really, really good. Do not underestimate Anyone's Legend just because there are a couple of players who have never made an international tournament. This might be a secret, sneaky threat to actually win the whole thing. But that's going to bring us to number 1 in my power rankings, and you knew who this was going to be from the beginning of the video. You didn't need to watch all the way to this point to know who number 1 was going to be. They're the best team in the world until proven otherwise. It's Gen.G coming in at number 1 for me, the only team to get an A+ grade. Duh, they went undefeated in the spring split. They have yet to lose a best of 5 this split. Of course they're the number 1 team coming into MSI. They're in the strongest region in the world, and no one's been able to take them down. It's genuinely ridiculous, just the kind of run that Gen.G is on right now, especially after how winter ended, where this team kind of seemed a bit frazzled. They looked very strange in the playoffs. They went in, you know, already kind of losing some momentum and some confidence because, you know, Damwon was looking really good. D plus Kia, I'm sorry, was looking easily like the number 1 team, and you had Gen.G, who was, you know, not great at the end of the regular season. They falter in their first matchup against Hanwha Life, end up going down to the lower bracket and almost to lose to Nongshim. Quite frankly, they should have lost to Nongshim and gotten 4th in the winter split, but Nongshim ends up throwing that series and they end up winning it. They randomly end up taking down D plus Kia in a pretty big upset in lower bracket finals, and then, you know, push HLE to a game 5 in the finals. Like, all of that ends up happening, but the morale and the vibe around this team just isn't all that great. And then spring happens, and it's been unstoppable. It's almost as if this team was never beatable in the first place. That's genuinely just how good it has been so far for Gen.G, and it's really, really fun to watch. Obviously, their lineup is ridiculous. It looks like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Duro at support. And even the players you might not be as familiar with if you only watch international competition, which is just Duro in the support position, have completely broken out over the course of 2025. So, I mean, let's just get it out of the way. Shout out to the one guy who's in my comment section every single video calling Chovy Choky. You know, I love you. I appreciate it. You give me a lot of engagement on the comment sections. You post a lot, and so it really helps boost the algorithm for the videos. Chovy's the best player in the world, and it's not close. Like, it's really not. There's nothing he does at a below, even like above average level. Like, everything he does is an A- grade or better, and that's just ridiculous. There's no other player in the world who can say that. Knight has come close at a couple of different times to being able to overtake that number 1 spot. I think in 2023, I even gave it to Knight in terms of my World's player ranking videos. Chovy's been number 1 ever since then, and he's not going to look back at any point. This guy is unbelievable. Again, like, people talk about how he's just AFK and that all he does is farm. Like, sure, yeah, like, that was great. You watched him when he was 17 years old and have never watched a game from him again. Like, I understand it, but, like, that's not who Chovy is anymore. He's arguably the best roamer in the world out of the mid lane position. That's how dominant he's been able to be in those instances, and It's not like he's not always up 40 CS anyways. He's just playing Ahri and Galio every single game, up 40 CS, constantly at every fight because he's roaming, and just min-maxing every bit of League of Legends. There has never been a player who's pushed the boundaries of the game quite like what Chovy is doing right now, because it almost feels impossible. Like, again, I remember there was one game this split, I think he was playing against KT Rolster, and he was up 65 CS, and he had been the one to roam, and BDD had not matched in any way. And it's freaking BDD, who's like one of the best mid laners in the world. Like, that's just the Chovy difference. There's nothing else to say. This guy is, you know, uncomparable. There's nobody in the world who does what Chovy does. And maybe I am glazing him. Like, call me a Chovy glazer. I genuinely do not care. I am a Chovy glazer. This guy is unreal, and he's done it for so long at this point that there's nothing else left to say. He's the over and over and over again MVP of not only Gen.G, but the LCK, and that should go for something. And then it's not like it gets any easier in any other capacity. The rest of this team is like all-stars and best players in the world everywhere else as well. I mean, specifically, you're looking at Ruler in the bot lane, which for some reason it's become an unpopular opinion to say that Ruler's the best AD carry in the world. I can't imagine why. Like, what do you want to see out of this guy through the last 3 or 4 weeks of the split? It was very clear that he was better than Viper, that he was the best AD carry in the LCK, and by proxy, that means he's the best ADC in the world. Do I think he's definitely more talented and mechanically superior to Elk or even Hope in the form that he's currently in? No, I think that there could theoretically be some conversation to have around that, but right now, the way that Ruler is playing, I think, is somehow underrated and undervalued. He was the second best player on this team in the spring split, in my opinion, and I think he deserves to be considered as such. He gets an A grade, and he comes in as my number 1 ADC at this level, which is the international level, at the top level of gaming. And then you've got Duro. I want to get to Duro now instead of later, because I genuinely just want to hype him up so much. This is another case of, not to brag, but me just like having a good eye for young supports. This is a guy who last year had another shot again on Sandbox or FearX this time. What is it with that organization and having really good support prospects? But, you know, him having a cup of coffee, playing 8 games at the LCK level, and me just fawning over the tape and almost giving him an all-pro and, you know, just glazing him over and over again in the LCK reviews last year, and then him getting a shot from Gen.G to basically be what Delight was for this team, except he's starting from an even better base than Delight was starting with, and he's blossomed even quicker than Delight blossomed. He's already become one of the best supports in the world. He does not need time to ramp up into that level. He did over the course of winter, where he had some up and down moments, but for the most part, in the spring split, he's just been like arguably the most productive support in the world. He certainly has outpaced Delight as a player, and Delight was dominating the beginning of the year, as you guys saw it firsthand if you watch international tournaments. But, you know, this guy just does a lot of things at a really high level. His engage mindset is ridiculously good. He's very creative. He finds very nice angles, and I think he's a consistent 2v2 player as well, which is important if you are going to be an engage first type of support. We looked at someone like Labrav, who's also an engage first type of support, but when he does it, he kind of has to sacrifice in the 2v2 because it's not necessarily a good part of the game plan for him. Duro doesn't really have that. He's just really freaking good at the game. He's good in the 2v2, and he's great in the team fight. So love Duro, and I love how he interacts with the rest of this team. There was a stretch where he was the best player on this team throughout a lot of the spring split, which is crazy. And then you get to the top side, and this is where I think things start to get a bit more human for Gen.G. Not that, you know, Ruler and Duro are inhuman. They're human players, and obviously, you know, can be faltered in some way, shape, or form. Chovy, I'm still out on. I don't know if he's necessarily human, but, you know, Keen and Canyon, for as much as they have going for them, they also have some things to be at least a little bit more like, about. And Canyon, that might surprise some people, because I've just seen a lot of people saying that Canyon is far and away the best jungler in the world right now. I don't agree with that. Like, I just don't see that on the tape. Like, we have to remember, this team had to reverse sweep Hanwha Life Esports to come here as the number 1 seed and to stay undefeated. A big reason they were in that hole is because Canyon absolutely sold games 1 and 2. Like, he was pretty horrible in the beginning of that series. Now, he probably was player of the game in all 3 of the final 3 games, but that's kind of the Canyon that this Gen.G team has gotten throughout a lot of the last 2 years, and it does kind of bring up the question of, like, would Canyon be considered the best jungler in the world in this form if he was playing for any team that wasn't Gen.G? I don't know, right? Like, I do think this team helps him out a lot. Chovy always winning, Ruler basically always being in a good spot and being the best mid-game skirmisher of any position ever definitely helps, but It's not like Canyon's best games aren't still the best jungle games in the world. It's just when he doesn't have those best games, it can sometimes get ugly a little bit quick, even against players that he is better than. But again, his best games are so far and away better than everyone else's best games in the world. And it's been like that since 2019. And it's basically never faltered since that time frame. So Canyon's still very good. I just think his consistency puts him slightly below where Tarzan is at for me. But, you know, that's a nitpick. And then you have Keen on the top side, who ironically enough has just kind of become a full-time background player for this team. He's basically exclusively playing Sion or meta top laners like Jason, Rumble, and Gwen and things like that. He's really not been a main character at all. They gave him resources last year, and there were times last year where it's like, oh, Keen, you know, is going to be playing strong side this game. They didn't give him that opportunity so far in 2025. He's never really been asked to be anything other than the 5th guy on this team. But if freaking Keen, who I think might be the best top laner in the world, if he's your 5th guy, you know, 369 might be better than him, but that's the only one, right? Like, if he's your 5th guy, it's unfair, it's unreal. That's just how talented Gen.G is, and that's where their baseline is coming from. If you put anyone else at the top of your power rankings going in to this tournament, I actually think you're trolling. And I'm not saying that they guarantee win. I'm not sitting here saying that Gen.G is definitely going to win, that they're going to keep their undefeated streak up, and they're going to have a ridiculous split, all of that. I think it's very possible that this team doesn't win. But if you're looking at an undefeated LCK team with this kind of talent and expecting them to lose, I don't know what to tell you. Like, the expectation for this team should be to run this tournament. They've gotten through harder challenges already in the LCK, in my opinion. There's no reason to expect them to struggle here. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI 2025 Primer and Power Rankings video. All 10 teams ranked from top to bottom in my expectation list, and that should segue pretty nicely into the play-in bracket, which you can see up on the screen here. 4 teams immediately slotted into the play-ins. Every other team, all 6 of the others, are immediately slotted into the main stage. This is the number 2 seed from every region, with the exception of the LCK, because they, of course, won the first stand tournament, and that is their reward. But it's a pretty fair play-in bracket. 2 teams are going to qualify. Obviously, it's a double elimination bracket, so pretty easy to go through it. You have G2 taking on Furia. You have Bilibili taking on GAM. These are very easy matchups to predict. G2 should slaughter Furia. I don't think they're good enough to compete with anybody at this tournament, and BLG should slaughter GAM, maybe even harder, because BLG just is that much better than everybody else here in the play-in bracket. I expect BLG to be able to beat G2, as you can expect from my power rankings video, and G2 to be able to run GAM likely in that qualification match. But let me know if you agree or disagree with those predictions, or if you perhaps have one of these teams higher or lower, or could potentially see an upset coming through here in the play-ins. And how do you think these teams are going to interact with a lot of the main stage teams? How do you think everything's going to go? Do you agree or disagree with my rankings for teams, for players? What is controversial or not controversial about my rankings? I'm always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be posting about MSI every single day on this channel. Every day of games, you're going to be getting a video upload here. So if you want a comprehensive overview of the entire tournament and everything that's going on, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.